I grew up in a house where love felt like a prize you had to earn, and somehow I was always just one step away from winning it. My parents never said they favored my older brother, but it was obvious in the way their faces lit up when he walked into a room, in the way they listened when he spoke, and in the way they excused every mistake he made, as if it were just another sign of his brilliance. He was louder than me, more confident, the kind of child who demanded attention without ever asking for it. I was quieter, the one who watched and learned early that speaking up only made things worse. At family gatherings, relatives would ruffle his hair and call him the future of the family. They would turn to me with polite smiles and ask if I was helping my mother in the kitchen. I learned to smile back, to swallow the sting in my chest, and to do as I was told. My mother would later tell me I was such a good girl for being so understanding, but the praise always felt hollow, like a reward for staying invisible. School was the one place where I felt like I existed. I worked hard, not because anyone pushed me to, but because it was the only way I knew how to prove to myself that I mattered. When I brought home report cards filled with high grades, my parents would glance at them quickly before setting them aside. My father would say things like, "Good. Keep it up," before returning to whatever he had been watching on television. When my brother barely passed his classes, they would sit with him for hours, discussing his potential, reassuring him that he was capable of greatness if he just applied himself. I used to lie awake at night wondering what I had done wrong. I replayed every conversation in my head, every moment where I might have been too quiet or too awkward. I promised myself that if I just tried harder, if I was more helpful, more obedient, more successful, maybe one day they would look at me the way they looked at him. My grandmother was the only person who seemed to see me. She lived in a small apartment across town and would invite me over on weekends. Her home smelled like old books and jasmine tea, and it was the one place where I didn't feel like I had to shrink myself to fit into the corners. She would ask me about my day, actually listening to my answers, nodding thoughtfully as if my thoughts were worth hearing. Sometimes she would pat my hand and say, "You have a strong heart. Don't let anyone make you believe otherwise." When she passed away during my last year of high school, it felt like the ground beneath me had cracked open. I cried for days, not just because she was gone, but because I knew the only person who had ever truly stood on my side had left me alone in a house where I was barely noticed. A few weeks after her funeral, a lawyer contacted us about her will. I sat at the dining table with my parents and brother as he explained that my grandmother had left her apartment to me. I remember the silence that followed, thick and uncomfortable. My mother forced a smile and said it was a sweet gesture, but I could see the way her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. My brother snorted and muttered something about it being unfair that the quiet one got the best gift. At first, I didn't even know how to feel. The apartment wasn't luxurious, but it was cozy and filled with memories of afternoons spent drinking tea and listening to my grandmother's stories. More than anything, it felt like a final hug from her, a reminder that at least one person in the world had believed I deserved something of my own. For a short time, I allowed myself to dream. I imagined studying in the small living room, decorating the walls with my own photos, and finally having a place where I didn't feel like a guest in my own life. I started researching universities in the city near the apartment, thinking that maybe, just maybe, this was my chance to start fresh. But my parents had other plans. They began talking about finances more often, about how expensive my brother's university tuition would be, and how difficult things had become for the family. At first, they spoke in vague terms, as if they were just thinking out loud. Then one evening, my father called me into the living room and told me to sit down. "We've been discussing your grandmother's apartment," he said, his tone formal, as if he were speaking to a stranger rather than his daughter. "It doesn't make sense for you to keep it right now. You're still young and managing property is complicated." I stared at him, my heart starting to pound. "But she left it to me," I said quietly. My mother sighed, already looking irritated. "She did, but she didn't understand our situation. The family needs that money. Your brother's future is at stake, and you're still living here anyway. I wanted to argue, to tell them that it wasn't fair, that it was the only thing my grandmother had left me. But years of being dismissed had trained me to doubt my own voice. Every time I opened my mouth, the words felt childish and selfish, exactly the way they would accuse me of being. The decision was made quickly after that. They contacted a real estate agent and arranged to sell the apartment. I was included in the paperwork because my signature was required, but no one actually asked for my opinion. My father simply pointed to the line where I needed to sign and said, "This is what's best for everyone." The day we went to finalize the sale is burned into my memory. We sat in a brightly lit office, the walls decorated with pictures of smiling families holding house keys. I held the pen in my trembling hand, staring at my name printed on the paper. For a moment, I thought about refusing, about standing up and walking out. But then I imagined the shouting that would follow, the accusations of being ungrateful and dramatic, and my courage slipped away. As soon as I signed, my mother let out a relieved laugh. My brother leaned back in his chair and joked about finally being able to afford a decent car once he graduated. They spoke as if I wasn't even there, as if the apartment had never meant anything more to me than a random piece of furniture. On the way home, my mother tried to sound comforting. "You'll thank us one day," she said. "You're not ready to live alone anyway. This is better for you." I turned my face toward the window so she wouldn't see the tears gathering in my eyes. The city lights blurred into streaks of yellow and white as we drove, and I felt something inside me begin to change. It wasn't a sudden burst of anger or a dramatic breakdown. It was quieter than that, like a door slowly closing in a room I hadn't realized was still open. That night, I sat on my bed and stared at the empty wall where I had once planned to hang photos of my grandmother's apartment. I realized that I had spent my entire life trying to earn a place in a family that saw me as expendable. They had taken the one thing that had been truly mine, and they had done it without hesitation, without even pretending to care how I felt. I didn't cry. Instead, I lay down and listened to the muffled sound of my parents laughing in the living room, talking about how much easier things would be now. Their voices drifted down the hallway, light and carefree, as if nothing important had been lost. That was the moment something inside me went completely still. Not shattered, not destroyed, just quiet in a way that felt deeper than sadness. I stopped expecting them to understand me. I stopped hoping they would one day apologize or realize what they had done. A part of me had finally accepted a truth I had been avoiding for years. I was on my own, even while living under their roof. And in that silence, something new began to grow, something small and fragile, but stronger than any approval I had ever chased. 2 months passed after the apartment was sold, but the atmosphere in the house never returned to what it had been before. If anything, it became more suffocating. My parents acted as though nothing unusual had happened, as though they hadn't taken the only thing that had ever been mine. They talked about my brother's university plans, his future, his dreams, and how proud they were of him. My name was only mentioned when there was something to criticize. Every dinner felt like a performance I was forced to sit through. My brother would complain about how stressful his classes were, and my mother would rush to comfort him, piling more food onto his plate and telling him not to worry. When I mentioned that I had applied for part-time jobs to start saving money for myself, my father scoffed. He said working would distract me from my studies, and that I should focus on being useful at home instead. It was clear that in their eyes, my efforts only mattered if they benefited them. The tension inside me built quietly, like pressure behind a sealed door. I tried to ignore it at first, convincing myself that this was just a difficult phase, and that things would eventually improve. But small moments kept chipping away at my patience. My mother would call me lazy for resting after long study sessions, even though she never said the same to my brother. My father would compare my quiet personality to weakness, saying that no one respected people who didn't speak up. Yet every time I tried to express my feelings, he shut me down before I could finish a sentence. One evening, during dinner, My brother joked in front of our relatives that I would probably live with our parents forever because I was too timid to survive on my own. Everyone laughed, including my parents. I forced a smile, but inside, something twisted painfully. It wasn't just the joke that hurt, it was how easily they agreed with it. How natural it felt for them to see me as someone who would never leave. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the laughter in my mind. I thought about my grandmother's apartment, about how different my life might have been if I had been brave enough to refuse signing those papers. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine leaving for real, not just dreaming about independence, but actually planning it. I started small. I gathered my documents, tucked them into a folder, and hid it at the bottom of my closet. I began saving the little money I received from tutoring classmates, keeping it in an envelope where no one would find it. I spent hours online researching cheap hostels, shared apartments, and job listings. Each step felt terrifying and thrilling at the same time, like I was slowly stepping onto a path I had never been allowed to walk before. The final argument that pushed me over the edge came on a Sunday afternoon. I had been studying in my room when my mother called me to help her clean the house before guests arrived. I told her I would come in 10 minutes, wanting to finish the paragraph I was reading. She stormed into my room before I could even close my book. "You're always so slow," she snapped. "Your brother would have been done already." I felt a spark of irritation, something I usually suppressed. "He's not the one you asked," I replied quietly. Her eyes narrowed, and within seconds the conversation turned into a lecture about my attitude, my lack of gratitude, and how much they had sacrificed for me. My father joined in, his voice louder and harsher, accusing me of becoming disrespectful. My brother stood in the doorway, watching with an amused smile. The words spilled out of me before I could stop them. I told them they had never treated me fairly, that selling the apartment had been wrong, and that I felt like a stranger in my own home. The room fell silent for a moment, and I thought, stupidly, that maybe they would finally listen. Instead, my father laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh or even a surprised one. It was mocking, dismissive. "You're being dramatic again," he said. "You act like you've been abused when all we've done is take care of you." My mother shook her head in disappointment. "You should be grateful you even have a place to stay. If you don't like it here, no one is forcing you to stay." The sentence hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. No one is forcing you to stay. For years, I had believed I had no other choice. But hearing those words out loud made something inside me click into place. They weren't asking me to leave, but they were making it clear they wouldn't miss me if I did. That night, I packed. I didn't have much to take. Most of my clothes were old and worn, and the few personal items I owned fit easily into a single suitcase. I folded everything carefully, my hands shaking not from sadness, but from fear of what would come next. Every sound in the hallway made me freeze, afraid someone would walk in and stop me before I could finish. When I zipped the suitcase closed, the sound felt louder than it should have, like a final decision being sealed. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long moment, staring at the familiar walls of my room. This space had never truly been mine, yet leaving it still felt surreal. I was stepping into the unknown with no safety net, no guarantee that I would succeed. The next morning, I waited until everyone was in the living room before dragging my suitcase down the hallway. The wheels rattled against the floor, announcing my departure before I even spoke. My parents looked up in confusion, and my brother's expression shifted into a smirk when he realized what I was doing. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. My mother blinked as if she hadn't heard me correctly. "Don't be ridiculous. Where would you even go?" "I'll figure it out." My father leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You'll be back in a week," he said flatly. "The world isn't as easy as you think." My brother chuckled. "Make sure you take pictures of your adventure. We'll need something to laugh about later." Their laughter followed me as I reached for the door. It echoed through the small apartment, bouncing off the walls and drilling into my chest. For a split second, I hesitated, my hand resting on the doorknob. I thought about turning around, apologizing, pretending this had all been a childish outburst. Instead, I opened the door and stepped outside. The cold air hit my face, sharp and real. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and began walking down the stairwell, the sound of their laughter fading with each step. By the time I reached the street, my heart was pounding so hard, I could barely hear anything else. I didn't have a plan beyond the next few days. A friend from university had agreed to let me stay on her couch temporarily, and I clung to that small lifeline as I made my way to the bus stop. The city felt different that morning, bigger, louder, and far less forgiving than it had when I lived behind the illusion of a family home. The first night on my friend's couch, I barely slept. I kept expecting my phone to ring, for my parents to demand that I come back or at least ask if I was safe. The silence was deafening. Days passed, then a week, and still nothing. No messages, no missed calls, not even a short text asking where I was. During the day, I threw myself into finding work. I printed copies of my resume and walked into every cafe, restaurant, and store that had a hiring sign in the window. Rejection became a routine. Some managers didn't even look at my application before shaking their heads. Others promised to call and never did. Each no stung, but it also hardened my determination. Eventually, a small cafe on the corner agreed to give me a trial shift. The pay was low and the hours were long. But when I received my first paycheck, I held it in my hands for several minutes, staring at my name printed on the slip. It was the first money I had ever earned completely on my own, and it felt more valuable than anything my parents had ever given me. Life was exhausting. I studied during the day, worked in the evenings, and returned to my friend's apartment late at night with aching feet and a mind full of worries. Yet beneath the exhaustion was a quiet sense of pride. No one was laughing at me here. No one was telling me I was incapable. Every small step forward was mine alone. Their laughter still echoed in my memory sometimes, especially when things got difficult. But instead of breaking me, it pushed me forward. I had walked away with nothing, no savings, no home, no support, but for the first time in my life, I was moving in a direction I had chosen myself. The months after I left my parents' home were some of the hardest and most transformative of my life. At first, every day felt like I was walking a tightrope with no safety net below me. I was constantly calculating how much money I had left, how many shifts I could take without falling behind in my studies, and how long my body could keep running on little sleep before it gave out. But even in the middle of that exhaustion, there was a quiet, steady sense of relief. No one was yelling at me anymore. No one was comparing me to my brother or reminding me that I was a disappointment. The small room I rented above the grocery store became my sanctuary. It was far from perfect. The paint on the walls was cracked in places, and during winter, cold air slipped in through the gaps around the window frame. At night, I could hear the hum of refrigerators from the store downstairs and the muffled voices of my roommates, arguing over dishes in the kitchen. Yet every time I unlocked my door and stepped inside, I felt a sense of ownership I had never experienced before. This space, however modest, belonged to me. I developed routines that helped me stay grounded. In the mornings, I woke up early to review my notes before heading to university. I carried homemade sandwiches in my bag to avoid spending money on campus food. After classes, I rushed to the cafe, tied my apron around my waist, and prepared myself for hours of standing, smiling, and serving customers. Some days were so busy that my legs trembled by the time my shift ended, but I rarely complained. I reminded myself that every tray I carried and every table I wiped was a step toward independence. The cafe itself became an unexpected place of growth. At first, I kept my head down, speaking only when necessary and avoiding eye contact with customers. Years of being told I was too quiet had made me believe that drawing attention to myself would only invite criticism. But working in customer service forced me to interact with strangers constantly. I had to take orders clearly, answer questions, and occasionally deal with complaints. One afternoon, a customer grew angry because his order was delayed. He raised his voice, accusing me of being incompetent. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I felt like the small, powerless girl I had been at home. But instead of apologizing excessively like I usually would have, I took a deep breath and calmly explained the situation. I offered him a solution without lowering my voice or shrinking away. To my surprise, he eventually backed down. That moment stayed with me long after my shift ended. It was a small victory, but it showed me that I was capable of standing my ground without falling apart. The more I practiced speaking confidently, the more natural it began to feel. Slowly, I started to realize that my quietness wasn't weakness, it had simply been a shield I used in a hostile environment. At university, my focus sharpened. Without the constant stress of family conflicts, I found it easier to concentrate during lectures and complete assignments on time. I began participating in class discussions, something I had avoided for years out of fear of being judged. The first time I raised my hand to share an opinion, my voice shook slightly, but my professor nodded encouragingly, and my classmates listened without interrupting. It was a simple interaction, yet it felt like a door opening to a version of myself I had never been allowed to explore. Money remained a constant concern. I kept a detailed notebook where I tracked every expense, from rent to groceries to bus fare. There were weeks when my bank account dropped so low that I had to choose between buying fresh vegetables or saving that money for textbooks. During those times, I reminded myself why I had left home in the first place. Going back would have been easier financially, but it would have cost me the self-respect I was slowly rebuilding. One of the biggest turning points came when I applied for a competitive scholarship designed to support students from difficult backgrounds. Writing the application essay forced me to confront my past in a way I had been avoiding. I described the loss of my grandmother, the sale of her apartment, and the moment I walked out of my parents' house with nothing but a suitcase. Putting those experiences into words was painful, but it also made me realize how far I had already come. When I received the acceptance letter, I was sitting on the edge of my narrow bed, reviewing notes for an upcoming exam. I opened the email casually, expecting another rejection. Instead, I saw the word, "Congratulations," at the top of the message. My hands began to shake as I read the rest of the letter. The scholarship would cover a significant portion of my tuition and provide a small monthly stipend. I cried that night, not out of sadness, but out of relief. For the first time since leaving home, I felt like someone in authority had looked at my struggles and decided they mattered. It wasn't just financial support. It was validation that my hard work had been seen. With the scholarship easing some of the pressure, I was able to reduce my hours at the cafe slightly and dedicate more time to my studies. I joined a study group with a few classmates who were just as determined as I was to succeed. We met in the library after classes, spreading our books across the table and quizzing each other until the security guards asked us to leave. Those evenings were filled with laughter, frustration, and a sense of belonging I had never felt at home. As months turned into years, my confidence grew in ways that surprised even me. I started dressing more professionally for presentations, speaking clearly during group projects, and even mentoring younger students who were struggling with their coursework. Each small step reinforced the idea that I wasn't the fragile, incapable person my family had always claimed I was. Graduation approached faster than I expected. On the day of the ceremony, I sat among hundreds of other students wearing a black gown and holding a cap in my hands. Families filled the seats in the auditorium, cheering and waving at their children. I felt a brief pang of sadness when I realized no one was there for me. But as I walked across the stage to receive my degree, that sadness was overshadowed by pride. I had reached this moment entirely on my own. Finding a job after graduation was challenging, but I treated it like another obstacle to overcome rather than a sign that I was failing. I spent hours tailoring my resume, writing cover letters, and preparing for interviews. Rejections still hurt, but they no longer shattered my confidence. I had already proven to myself that I could survive worse. Eventually, I secured an entry-level position at a financial firm. The office environment was intimidating at first. Everyone seemed so polished and self-assured, but I reminded myself that I had earned my place there. I listened carefully during meetings, took detailed notes, and completed every task to the best of my ability. My supervisors began to notice my reliability and attention to detail, and gradually, I was given more responsibility. The first time I received a full salary deposit into my bank account, I stared at the numbers on the screen in disbelief. This was more money than I had ever seen at once, and it had come from my own effort. I used part of it to move into a better apartment, one with sturdy walls, reliable heating, and a small balcony where I could sit in the evenings with a cup of tea. Standing in that new apartment on the first night, surrounded by boxes and the soft glow of a single lamp, I felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. I thought back to the girl who had once been too afraid to speak up at the dinner table. The girl who had signed away her grandmother's apartment because she didn't believe she had the right to refuse. That girl still existed inside me, but she was no longer in control. The life I had built was quiet and steady, shaped not by dramatic acts of revenge, but by years of persistence and resilience. I had learned to trust my own decisions, to value my own voice, and to create a future that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. In the silence that followed my departure from my family, I had discovered a strength that had been buried beneath years of doubt. And as I looked around my new home, I realized that the silence I once feared had become my greatest ally. It had given me the space to grow, to heal, and to build a life that was entirely, undeniably my own. The call came on an ordinary evening, the kind that usually passed without leaving any memory behind. I had just returned home from work, kicked off my shoes, and was standing in the kitchen waiting for water to boil for tea when my phone began to vibrate on the counter. I glanced at the screen absent-mindedly, expecting to see a message from a colleague or one of the friends I occasionally met on weekends. Instead, I froze when I saw my mother's name flashing across the display. For a moment, I thought it might be a mistake. Years had passed without a single call or message from my family. I had grown so used to their silence that their sudden reappearance felt unreal, like a ghost from a life I had already buried. My first instinct was to ignore it. My hand hovered over the phone as it continued to ring, each vibration echoing through the quiet apartment. Curiosity and a strange sense of obligation finally pushed me to answer. "Hello." My voice sounded cautious, distant even to my own ears. There was a brief pause on the other end before my mother spoke. It's me." Her voice was softer than I remembered, lacking the sharp edge that had once dominated every conversation. "How are you?" The question felt absurd. After years of silence, she was asking how I was, as if we had spoken just yesterday. I swallowed the bitter response that rose in my throat and replied politely that I was fine. The conversation stumbled forward awkwardly, filled with small talk that felt forced and meaningless. She asked about my job, my health, my apartment. I answered in short sentences, unsure of what she really wanted. Finally, she cleared her throat and said, "We should meet. Your father and your brother, we all want to see you." I hesitated. Every instinct told me to refuse, to protect the peace I had built for myself. But another part of me, perhaps the part that had once desperately wanted their approval, needed to see them again, if only to prove to myself that I was no longer the same person they had once controlled. After a few seconds of silence, I agreed to meet them at a small cafe near the city center the following week. The days leading up to the meeting were strangely tense. I found myself replaying old memories, remembering the arguments, the laughter as I left, and the years of silence that followed. I wondered how they would react when they saw me again. Would they be proud of what I had accomplished, or would they still see me as the weak daughter who had run away? When the day finally arrived, I chose my outfit carefully, settling on a simple but elegant dress and a tailored coat. It wasn't about impressing them. It was about reminding myself of how far I had come. As I approached the cafe, my heart began to race, the familiar anxiety of my childhood creeping back in despite my efforts to stay calm. I spotted them immediately through the glass window. They were sitting at a corner table, my father staring down at his phone, my brother tapping his fingers impatiently against the table, and my mother scanning the room with nervous energy. They looked older than I remembered. The confidence that had once defined my father's posture seemed diminished, and my brother's once carefree expression was replaced by a tight, restless frown. When I stepped inside, My mother was the first to notice me. Her eyes widened slightly, and she stood up so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "You're here," she said, as if she had been afraid I wouldn't come. We exchanged an awkward hug that felt more like a formality than genuine affection. My father nodded at me stiffly, and my brother offered a short, forced smile. I sat down across from them, folding my hands neatly in my lap to hide their slight tremble. For a few minutes, they talked about trivial things: the weather, traffic, how busy the city had become. I answered politely, but inside I was waiting for the real reason behind this meeting to surface. It didn't take long. My father finally leaned forward, his expression serious. "We're in a bit of trouble," he said bluntly. "Financial trouble." My chest tightened, but I said nothing, allowing him to continue. He explained that he had invested most of their savings in a business opportunity a few years earlier. The venture had seemed promising at first, but it had slowly begun to fail. Debts had piled up, and the money from my grandmother's apartment, money they had once justified taking from me, had long since disappeared. Creditors were now threatening legal action, and they were struggling to keep up with payments. As he spoke, my mother watched me anxiously, searching my face for any sign of sympathy. My brother kept his eyes on the table, his jaw clenched. The roles in the room had shifted in a way that felt surreal. These were the same people who had once laughed at the idea that I could survive on my own. Now they were sitting in front of me, admitting their failures and asking for help. "We know we haven't been the best parents," my mother said hesitantly, her voice trembling. "But we're still family. We thought maybe you could help us, just until we get back on our feet." The words hung in the air between us. I took a slow sip of my coffee to give myself time to think. A part of me felt a flicker of pity. They looked tired and desperate, so different from the confident figures who had once dominated every room they entered. But alongside that pity was a deep, steady reminder of everything that had led to this moment. The apartment, the laughter, the years of silence when I had struggled alone. My brother finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine. "You've done well for yourself, haven't you?" he said, his tone strained. "You've got a good job, a nice place. It wouldn't hurt you to help us out." The entitlement in his voice was faint but still there, buried beneath layers of desperation. It was enough to snap something inside me back into place. They weren't apologizing because they had realized they were wrong. They were apologizing because they needed something. I placed my cup down carefully, making sure my hands didn't shake. "Why didn't you contact me before things got this bad?" I asked quietly. My father's gaze shifted away. "We thought we could handle it," he muttered. The irony of his words was almost painful. They had always believed they were stronger, smarter, more capable than me. Now they were admitting they had misjudged their own limits. Silence settled over the table, heavy and uncomfortable. I could feel their expectation pressing against me, waiting for me to offer reassurance, to promise that everything would be okay. In that moment, I realized just how much power I held. The girl who had once begged for scraps of their approval was gone. In her place sat a woman who had built her life without their help, and who now had the choice to decide how this story would continue. I didn't give them an answer that day. Instead, I told them I needed time to think. Their relief was immediate, as if they had already assumed my hesitation meant eventual agreement. We parted with awkward goodbyes, my mother squeezing my hand a little too tightly, my father nodding silently, and my brother avoiding my gaze once more. As I walked out of the cafe and into the cool evening air, my mind raced with conflicting emotions: anger, sadness, and an unexpected sense of closure. The past I had tried so hard to escape had finally caught up with me, but this time I wasn't powerless. This time I was the one in control of what happened next. The days after the meeting felt heavier than I expected. I had thought that seeing my family again would either reopen old wounds or give me a sense of closure, but instead it left me suspended somewhere in between. Their faces, older and more worn than I remembered, lingered in my thoughts. I kept replaying the conversation in my mind, analyzing every word, every pause, every look they had exchanged when they thought I wasn't paying attention. At work, I found it difficult to concentrate. Numbers on spreadsheets blurred together, and I had to reread emails multiple times before they made sense. My colleagues noticed my distraction, asking if everything was okay. I reassured them with polite smiles, unwilling to drag my personal life into the office. For years, I had built a version of myself that was calm and composed, someone who didn't let emotions spill into professional spaces. Now, it felt like the past was knocking loudly at a door I had worked hard to keep closed. At home, the silence of my apartment, which had once been comforting, began to feel unsettling. I caught myself staring at my phone more often than usual, half expecting another message or call from my mother. They didn't reach out again, perhaps giving me the time I had asked for, or perhaps assuming that my hesitation meant I would eventually say yes. That assumption stirred a quiet anger inside me. Even now, after everything, they still believed they were entitled to my help. I spent long evenings sitting by the window, watching the city lights flicker to life as the sun disappeared behind the buildings. This had become my ritual whenever I needed to think. With a cup of tea warming my hands, I forced myself to confront the question I had been avoiding: did I owe them anything? Memories surfaced one after another. I saw my grandmother's apartment, the papers I had signed with trembling hands, my parents laughing as they discussed what they would do with the money. I remembered the cold night I had dragged my suitcase down the stairwell, their laughter echoing behind me. I remembered the months of exhaustion that followed. The fear of not having enough money for rent, the nights I cried quietly so my roommates wouldn't hear. They hadn't been there for any of that. They hadn't called to check if I was safe, hadn't asked if I needed help, hadn't even acknowledged my existence, until they were the ones in trouble. The more I thought about it, the clearer the truth became. Helping them wouldn't be an act of kindness born from love. It would be an act of obligation forced by guilt they had no right to place on me. A week after our meeting, my mother finally called again. I answered calmly, already knowing what I was going to say. She didn't bother with small talk this time. "We've been waiting to hear from you," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. "Have you made a decision?" I closed my eyes briefly, taking a slow breath. "Yes," I replied. "I have." There was a pause, the kind that fills with unspoken hope. I imagined her sitting at the kitchen table, my father and brother nearby, all of them waiting for me to say the words they wanted to hear. "I won't be able to help you financially," I said, keeping my tone gentle but firm. "I'm sorry." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before she spoke again. You won't help your own parents." Her voice cracked, disbelief bleeding into hurt. "I've spent years building my life on my own," I said quietly. "When I needed help, no one was there for me. I can't pretend that didn't happen." My father's voice suddenly joined the call in the background, louder and sharper. "This is unbelievable," he snapped. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us." His words stung, not because they were true, but because they sounded so familiar. It was the same guilt he had used throughout my childhood, the same way of twisting reality to make me feel ungrateful for asking for basic fairness. "What did you do for me?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. "You took the one thing Grandma left me. You told me I'd fail without you. You laughed when I left." The line went quiet again. I could almost feel their shock through the phone. I had never spoken to them like this before, never dared to list their actions so plainly. My mother began to cry softly. "We made mistakes," she said between sobs. "But we're still your family." "I know," I replied. "And I hope you find a way to fix things. But I can't fix them for you." I ended the call before they could say anything else. My hands shook as I set the phone down, and for a moment I just stood there in the middle of my living room, listening to my own heartbeat echo in my ears. Saying no had been harder than I expected. It felt like cutting the final thread that still tied me to the version of myself who had always tried to please them. That evening, I took a long walk through the neighborhood. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain, and the streets were quieter than usual. As I walked, a strange sense of calm began to settle over me. I realized that I wasn't filled with guilt or regret. Instead, I felt lighter, as if I had finally put down a weight I had been carrying for years without noticing. Days turned into weeks, and I heard nothing more from my family. No angry messages, no attempts to change my mind. Their silence felt different this time, not like abandonment, but like acceptance, even if it was a bitter one. I used that silence to focus on my own life, throwing myself back into work and reconnecting with friends I had neglected during the emotional turmoil. One evening, while reorganizing a drawer, I found an old photo of my grandmother and me sitting on the balcony of her apartment. I was younger in the picture, smiling shyly while she wrapped an arm around my shoulders. I traced the outline of her face with my finger, feeling a lump rise in my throat. She had always believed in me, always told me that I deserved to be treated with kindness and respect. For the first time, I felt certain that she would have understood the choice I had made. Months later, I heard through a distant relative that my parents had been forced to sell their house to pay off some of their debts. My brother had taken a job in another city, and the family had scattered in ways I never could have imagined during my childhood. When I received that news, I expected to feel satisfaction or vindication. Instead, I felt a quiet sadness for what our family had become. But alongside that sadness was a deeper sense of peace. I had broken a cycle that could have continued for the rest of my life, the cycle of sacrificing my own well-being to keep people who didn't value me comfortable. By refusing to rescue them, I had finally chosen myself in a way I never had before. On the anniversary of the day I left home, I stood on the balcony of my apartment, watching the sun set over the city. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, and the distant hum of traffic blended with the evening breeze. I thought about the girl who had walked away with a single suitcase, her heart pounding with fear and uncertainty. She had been laughed at, underestimated, and dismissed as someone who would never survive on her own. If she could see me now, standing in a home I had built with my own hard work, she would hardly believe how far we had come. My silence back then had not been weakness. It had been the first step toward a life where my voice finally mattered. They had laughed when I walked away with nothing. But in the end, it was that very nothingness that gave me the freedom to build everything they could never take from me: independence, dignity, and the unshakable knowledge that my worth was never defined by their approval.